The final presentation of the session is a co-production of Lucas Pawlik, a philosopher and writer from the Viennese University of Arts, and Thomas Cook, an American actor from Julliard Acting School. This is a dialogical short play performed to express one interpretation of Heinz von Foerster's idea of systemics as unity of science and art, as this dialogical drama takes place in the mind of a person lying in bed at night. You are invited to close your eyes and see more clearly what is happening. Tom and Lucas. I closer, Tom. Okay.
Okay. In bed with Constructivism, a metalogue. Precautionary remarks. Though disguised as a presentation, the following is a circular story with various changes of perspective. As a metalogue, its form will be representative for its content. It will require a self-aware observer for its interpretation to make sense. Reminding oneself of Heinz von Foerster's view of magic might prove useful. There's a lady floating in the air, etc., etc. The usual argument is something like this. Aha, these magicians try to direct my attention away, try to confuse my thinking, try to do this and that so that I don't observe what they are really doing. In fact, the whole magic consists of inviting you to create a world for yourself, creating a new world in which there are ladies floating, in which an elephant is disappearing. Magic is not the question of distracting you of any kind of a gimmick. It is the question of making you very attentive to a particular universe you are creating. Magic is the strategy of constructivism. Darkness. A young man is lying in his bed. His imagination is running wild.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin this presentation by saying what a great excitement it is to be part of this third International Heinz von Foerster Conference, and therefore part of those few traditions in which the present is allowed to determine the past, and may thereby create its own future. Heinz von Foerster well-known maxim, every moment we are free to act towards a future we desire, may be taken as historical evidence that one should be encouraged to do so. In embracing the concept of change as a process that obliterates the rules of the past and inventing what is appropriate at the time, one most certainly continues his tradition. Realizing this momentum of change as central to his tradition, however, one is inclined to ask oneself, does it make sense at all to hold a Heinz von Foerster conference and ritually repeat such a conference every year? Wouldn't it be more appropriate to act spontaneously and come up with a new concept every year which leads to a future which is desirable from the viewpoint of an always changing present moment? Thinking linearly, one would have to immediately call our hosts, Karl and Albert Mueller, to ask them to cancel such conferences because the notion of change is not embraced in them. Within a circular view, however, the meaning of such rituals changes and can not only be embraced through mere self-reference, but even more deeply by integrating a dynamic paradox within this self-reference. So it is not surprising that when Heinz von Foerster was asked how he understands the meaning of rituals, he said the meaning of a ritual is to embrace what is new. Celebrating Christmas or holidays, for example, we repeat certain steps and procedures, but what for? We repeat them so that what is new this year becomes obvious to us. If we do not repeat certain patterns, how could we know what has changed? Thinking this through, I came to the conclusion that Albert and Karl Mueller have, through their endeavors, been able to embrace the process of change by a complementary strategy which I would outline as every moment we are free to act towards a past we desire. As both are historians and Viennese, it was of course utterly clear to them that the past too is an invention of the present and keeps changing as we look at it. Only some of such pasts embrace the present in a way that a desirable future is perceivable at all. In this way, I understand our annual meetings as having another look, and by coming together, remembering a past which enables us to perceive to invent the now in which we can act towards a future we desire.
The young man pauses.
Yes, something like this. Inventing a here and now which enables us to act is always a good beginning. Still, who will understand the meaning of remembering as becoming part of it? It's crucial. You are part of the world you remember, just as you become part of the world by perceiving it. Well, only if you draw your attention towards your own perceiving, of course. If we just think, just perceive, just act, the world just appears as it is. This enormous responsibility concerning the choices we create and the way how they are shaping our world only comes up if we become aware that through drawing attention towards ourselves, something changes. Only when the dynamic of our sensory-motory system and our cognition changes, its eigendynamics becomes obvious at all. Otherwise, we perceive just our world and ourselves as we are used to. How did Peter Bexley put it?
The message is a fundamental one of cybernetics. We cannot escape collisions, so let's implement them. Disturbances and collisions are the essence of the game. Without disturbances, the very idea of a feedback loop would be completely useless.
Yes. Where was I? Our possibility of inventing our own framework. If I'm going to talk about Heinz, I must first create awareness that whatever we perceive or think is an act of our imagination. It is a presentation of our own self-organization.
Heinz, I presented the history of my development as a scientist, as a human being, as a thinker, because I wanted to give my strange position regarding ethics some kind of foundation. What I believe came out of it is that ethics is linked to freedom. That means there must exist a fundamental freedom for me to be able to act without having been forced. And there my invention of the in principle undecidable questions came in very handy. Because from this position, I can reach into the realm of freedom. Because when faced with an in principle undecidable question, I can really do as I want. For nobody, no logic, no rule of the game, nothing forces me to now act thus and thus. What comes forth through this invitation of freedom? What comes forth through this invitation is that I will establish the framework within which I will make my decisions only just now. What does this invitation of freedom give rise to? This invitation gives rise to my establishing the framework within which I will make my decisions only just now. That is to say, I do not impose a framework like mathematics. I do not impose a framework like a moral code, a decalogue. I do not impose any of these frameworks, but say to myself, now, Heinz, invent the framework within which you now want to decide. And for me, the depth of this new framework is crucial for the problem of ethics.
Yes, this is how I will begin. I will use my introduction questioning the purpose of our repeated Heinz von Foerster conferences to show that however we decide to understand systemics, we should preserve our freedom to reinvent ourselves so that we are not enslaved by our descriptions of the past. We must sustain a view through which we can draw the past into our present, make it part of our present invention, as Heinz expressed it in Der Anfang von Himmel und Erde hat keinen Namen.
The here and now is a central notion to me. It is the beginning of every beginning. Therefore, the here and now is always a new creation, a kind of genesis. The moment in which I do what I do is always new. It has never been there before. Nothing has been there before, because what was is as I believe it has been before.
Heinz and systemics are now completely our inventions. Heinz has become part of the world, which just is how it is. He cannot talk back. It is how we tell it. We are the witnesses. Quick, where's my dictaphone? Damn, darkness. Whatever, I'll make notes.
The author jumps out of his bed, scribbles down some illegible notes, whose meaning will be doubtful to him a couple of days later. Then he lies down again.
The beginning of heaven and earth has no name. A wonderful thought turned into a book he wrote together with our hosts. I definitely have to use this quote. Heinz quoted it as the motto of George Spencer Brown's Laws of Form. It is the third line in the opening poem of the Tao Te Ching. I guess Heinz would have been delighted to know he had picked the third line of one of the greatest poems ever written, by the poet who had the greatest impact on Chinese culture, Lao Tzu. His choice fits when you think he understood our freedom of choice as realizing man is not a thing, but a drama, and realizing we are the novelists of our lives. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. The nameless is the beginning of the 10,000 things, the Taoist metaphor for everything and everything. Chinese pictograms give rise to so many different possible translations. Draw the distinction of making no distinction, and a universe comes into being.
The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless is the origin of all things. The named is the mother of all things. Therefore, the subtleties of the way are always apprehended through their formlessness. The limits of things are always seen through their form. Form and formlessness, these two together emerge. They have different names, yet they are called the same.
It is a poem I wrestled with since I was a child, and its poetry grew richer with translation. The version of my original encounter, a translation by Richard Wilhelm, Der Sinn, der man ersinnen kann, ist nicht der ewige Sinn, uses sin as a translation for Tao, or the way, which compromises both sense and meaning. So you get the sense which can be sensed is not the eternal sense, and the meaning which can be meant is not the eternal meaning. The German translation sin already expresses the wonderful unity of our cognitive system and our perceptual system. Later on, Alan Watts pointed out that way and word can be understood synonymous. So you get the way which can be weighed, W-A-Y-E-D, you would have to make up this word, or the way which can be traveled or constructed, perhaps, is not the permanent way. If I had any guts, I would speak about this kind of poetry in my presentation and how it led me to my understanding of language. But I am certainly not going to be the one being torn apart speaking about Taoism and poetry in the middle of a cybernetics conference. It would need a Heinz to do so. He had the courage to say he admires poets, as they could draw the observers into the world of their descriptions, and so tell him what it is about when we talk about life. He had the courage to call thermodynamics a branch of poetry. He had the courage to say that science, since it answers principally undecidable questions, enters into a battle between poets over telling a story of the world for everybody to believe. Yes, this is what it must have been like. His understanding of poetry matches Percy Shelley's, who wrote that every language near to its source is in itself the chaos of a cyclic poem. But I am afraid. I am the coward not daring to tell the story which came up out of the blue when Tom tried to teach me some proper English pronunciation. Lucas, inexplicability.
Inexplicability.
Yes, see? All English is just ow, wow, wow, noise becoming sound through repetitions with slight variations. Remember Alan Watts, yeah? It's like what the birds do in the trees. Tweet, tweet, tweet. Or the Zen master saying that, from the bathtub to the bathtub, I have uttered stuff and nonsense. The bathtub in which the baby is washed at birth, and the bathtub in which the corpse is prepared for burial. What's the cybernetic or constructivist point of view on language?
Well, in a similar way, language is essentially movement. It's the pattern of correlation of externally perceivable movements of your body, your actions, and internal movements of your body, the self-organization of your nervous system and other bodily system. Essentially, it's all these processes happening together. This is the beauty of Heinz's idea of eigenbehavior, processes that produce themselves and if interlinked, produce each other. You no longer need to refer to an external pre-designed world. All the different processes can refer to each other and thus bring forth you and your world. All you need is some noise to get them going. When you are trying to make sense of language as a fixed set of descriptions, you are cutting these processes apart. When you separate them from your activity, you lose your relation, and the futile attempt of putting your separated units together will produce a knowledge that makes you helpless all your life.
He pulls Steps to an Ecology of Mind from the shelf and starts to read.
Gregory Bateson. Anyhow, it is all nonsense. I mean, the whole notion that language is made of words is all nonsense. And when I said that gestures could not be translated into mere words, I was talking nonsense. Because there are no such things as mere words. All the syntax and grammar and all that stuff is nonsense. It's based on the idea that mere words exist, and there are none. See? If you indulge in the fantasy of living as organisms for a moment, what do? I say blah, 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 you say blah, blah, blah. We move our hands, move around, then again, think, imagine something. All of this refers to everything else. Language becomes a human way to correlate our movements internally and externally.
Yes, but like Alan says, the price we are paying for knowing we can control life is knowing that we can't in the long run. We know we are going to die, and life, for all we know, changes everything we know, whether we talk about descriptions or organisms. This is the difficulty of knowing you know.
He pulls Macbeth out of his pocket.
Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Yes, exactly. This is as difficult to get as it is difficult to get along with. Language signifies no thing in the ordinary sense. You cannot fix any meaning onto a description. It always means what you will make out of it at the present moment. Paraphrasing Heinz, a description only exists as a pattern within the observer's inferences drawn from this description. And as these inferences are themselves patterns of our movements, here and now it follows, terminal presentations, terminal descriptions are manifest in the organism's movement. Consequently, the logical structure of descriptions arises from the logical structure of our movements.
Sorry, I draw somehow confusing inferences from this description.
I see. Let's try again. Our communication correlates the pattern of our internal and external movements whose developments and structures can be understood as presentations of this process of correlation. In other words, we are free to understand this world and its histories as our dance together. The world is, we are, what we are all doing together. And whatever we do changes what the world is like, what we are like. It's this recurring poetic form-giving conversation through which we and the world arise.
So Macbeth's desperation about our incompetence to control our destiny could be answered with a Whitman poem. O me, O life, of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish, of myself forever reproaching myself, of the poor results of all, of the plodding and sordid crowds I see around me. What good amid these, O me, O life? Answer, that you are here, that life exists and identity, that the powerful play goes on, and you will contribute a verse.
And what will our verse be? The question raised in that poet society. If you think of poetry as coming from the Greek poem, in a sense of to do, to create, maybe even to bring forth form, this poem would express Heinz's position of being part of the world beautifully. You move from dead descriptions to living descriptions. You discard the idea of referring to the existence of a separated outside world. You discard a world of separated descriptions existing outside of you. If you live as part of the world, you and your world come forth through this way of living. You become the verse you cannot separate from your poem.
I guess if we actually lived like this, it would mean moving from a dead poets to a living poet society after all. But what about me, by myself? Solipsism. What about the man alone who strives to experience this world as just his own invention?
The man alone? He would just have to remember that he is only alone when compared to others. Then he no longer is. The young man turns around in his bed and starts muttering to an invisible audience.
Every entity is meaningful only through the pattern through which it comes forth. A teacher and two students are walking through the forest. Suddenly, the teacher picks up a stick and asks one of the students, "What is this?" The student is stunned. He looks at the stick and hesitates. The teacher hits the student. He throws the stick away and they walk on. After a while, they stop again. Again, the teacher picks up a stick and asks the other student, "What is this?" The student replies, "I'm not sure. Let me see. Give it to me for a moment." The teacher hands over the stick. The student grabs the stick and hits the teacher. Our knowledge becomes a delusion, a living conflict if it is not understood within the matrix of our living within which it is embraced. A student and a teacher stand in a kitchen. The student asks the teacher for a knife, which the teacher holds out to him, pointed end first. "Give me the other end," the student says. The teacher replies, "What would you do with the other end?" I see the history of our cultures full of stories and poems, of Zen masters, poets, magicians, and other people of this kind who would blossom if embedded in a systemic form of living. However, I see the value of this word only as a sign of agreement that it is sound to continuously create new context of their embedment. I came to university convinced of a very peculiar notion of knowledge, that man is the method of our sciences, that the ultimate understanding of knowledge is to experience how it changes ourselves and our lives. I got startled by this man saying, "I am my machine. I am my invention." Through this manner of self-reference, Heinz was to me one of the few thinkers who could guide you how to think, to act, and perceive in a way that sustains the pattern which connects your items of learning with yourself. This makes him one of the greatest poets of our time for me. He could show how to understand language, thinking and perceiving, to experience yourself included in this living dance of this ongoing poem we call our world. When I ask myself how it happened that I again and again made the effort to understand these complex ideas of Heinz, which are drawn together from so many fields, so many histories, my answer was that his articles, books, and lectures were never an end to themselves, but opening statements of a dialogue. So for me, his continuous self-presentation, which could also be understood as narcissism, was merely setting an example, a living encouragement to reinvent oneself and thereby acknowledge the choice of having a choice through creating a choice. The conceptual tools he used to develop and sustain the story of his life, like magic, cybernetics, constructivism, and systemics, are all very much alike. Heinz says, "Magic is to make you very aware of the particular universe you are creating," and called it the strategy of constructivism. How does to make oneself very aware of the particular universe you are creating differ from observing systems, observing the universe coming forth through their observing? The magic of his constructivism is the magic of second-order cybernetics. When grasping this and listening to his reflection on Albert Magnus's medieval definition of magic, magic is the common root of all sciences, whether they deal with stars, with stones, with animals, or with plants. It does not take much imagination to see how the stones become inanimate objects, machines, how animals become humans and human society, how understanding plants becomes understanding ecology. And suddenly, magic reveals itself as the medieval great-great-grandfather of cybernetics. And as for the relation of magic and systemics, what is the pattern which connects the crab to the lobster, the orchid to the primrose, magic to systemics, and the six of them to me, and me to you? I listened to Heinz saying,
"What makes the crab and me relate to you? This is how you got to think. These are the coherences you must think through. I cannot. One cannot imagine better. What a magician could do better than to think those together."
The very example Heinz used to describe how a systemicist acts is the same he had already used years before to describe how a magician acts. Going further, following Heinz von Foerster's thinking, one can only avoid becoming a magician if one stops speaking and thinking at all.
Heinz, through magic, so I claim, you learn how to deal with the unknowable without asking why. Thus, the magical view would be, how do I learn to deal with things of which I do not know how to explain them? And I further claim that the art of a magician consists in organizing processes which are unexplainable. He knows only how to deal with such processes. Claim number 3, we are all continuously magicians, and that already from the start when we begin to speak and assume that others understand what we say. So my third claim concerning the magic of language, this cannot be explained in the usual way. The magic of language consists in its inexplicability.
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 Yes. Still, it is perfectly understandable that nobody would seriously pick up on this notion of magic, as systemics is, of course, an attractive, mysterious lady floating in the air who catches everybody's attention. Magic, on the other hand, is an uncanny elephant in the academic china shop, which, no matter how often mentioned, always keeps disappearing, gently trotting off the stage, while everybody's eyes rest fascinated on the floating lady. The fact that we are not meeting at a conference on magic, but on systemics, tells me that Karl and Albert Mueller have already acknowledged that there is indeed a battle of poets going on, and they are very aware that the notion of magic has been so discredited that it would be impossible to compete in this battle of creating a history everybody believes in and wants to participate in. Now, since the magic of drawing attention to the particular universe we are creating is not dependent on the use of specific words, but simply on being practiced, there is no harm done